listening to a podcast, Jocko Willink talking to Daryl Cooper about Ukraine. And Daryl Cooper, who's a pretty impressive lay scholar and thinker and historian in particular, and I would say Soviet historian in particular, he said that a reasonable case can be made that no country has suffered more in the 20th century and maybe ever than Ukraine. Basically, if you add up the deaths from World War I, collectivization under Stalin, the Holodomor, which you're probably somewhat familiar with, in World War II, Ukraine lost like a third of its population. Yeah. Not a third of its fighting age male population, a third of its population. It is a pretty unfortunate geography. It's like Poland, being sandwiched
right,
between.
Exactly. Literally always being in the wrong place geopolitically.
Yeah. Got Stalin on one side and Hitler on the other. Okay, so one way that we could start is you could simply kind of bring us up to speed on what is happening right now.
Sure. So what's happening right now is that essentially over the last year or so, Russia has been steadily increasing the quantity of military forces it maintains within invasion range of Ukraine. And just in the last 2 or 3 months, that number has started to increase quite rapidly, to the point where I think the latest estimate is something like 130,000 troops stationed on the northern, eastern, and southern boundaries of Ukraine with Russia. And that's not the sort of thing that happens by accident or at all commonly in international affairs. Ordinarily, governments do not assemble that large a military force on a neighboring country's borders unless they intend to make use of that force for violence. So, the rest of the world, Ukraine itself, has become steadily more concerned that, Russia intends to use those forces in violence against Ukraine, whether it be to coerce the government or occupy additional territory of Ukraine. It already occupies Crimea, which is this big island that still is part of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, but is effectively owned now by the Russians. And these two provinces in eastern Ukraine, which Russia sent unofficial military forces into in 2014 in order to help them break away from the main Ukrainian government. And so this very real, very large increase in military forces near Ukraine has happened at the same time as Vladimir Putin has been making increasingly bellicose statements about what's going on in Ukraine and the provocations it has offered to Russia, the provocations that NATO and the United States have been doing in Ukraine that are against Russian interests. And of late, these kind of ahistorical claims about Ukraine's not actually a country, it's always been part of Russia, and its ethnic origins are the same as the ethnic origins of the Russian people, and this sort of I would call it old school nationalist history that's not much bothered with the actual historical facts, but is very convenient politically to make claims to territory you don't currently own. So that's what's going on, and that's what all the press coverage and the increasingly heated rhetoric from the United States and NATO and Russia has been all about.
Okay, there are a lot of different directions we could go in right now. Here's one question I'm curious about. I think it's the case that what Putin is currently doing on the Ukrainian border can only be effective if there is a credible threat that he will actually invade. I've heard some commentators say there's no chance that he will invade, but if the US and other NATO members and Ukraine truly believed there was a 0% chance that he would invade, then he would have no leverage over them.
That's
correct?
Right. Through the military forces. That's right.
Right. So there is a credible threat that he will invade, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's unpack that a little bit. If he invades, what is the range of things that he might do?
It's a pretty big range. You could imagine a partial invasion that's just designed to capture a portion of Ukraine's territory. So you could imagine those forces on the border being used to like formally occupy and annex the two eastern regions of Ukraine that are already kind of sort of controlled by Russia. You could imagine the use of those forces to extend that territory further into Ukraine, like maybe conquering Ukraine's southern coast to create a land connection controlled by Russia between the eastern provinces and Crimea. You could imagine a sort of purely coercive campaign in which those forces don't really seek to like permanently occupy territory, but they're instead used to, pound away at centers of power in Ukraine, like government facilities, the Ukrainian military, as an attempt to destabilize the government or induce it to surrender to Putin's demands. Or you could imagine those forces being used to invade all of Ukraine, sack the capital, and formally conquer Ukraine.
The probability of the latter option, of actually sacking Kiev and taking control of the country, Hitler style. I say Hitler style only because I'm thinking of Hitler rolling into Paris. That seems like a very distant possibility.
I mean,
it seems much more likely to me that he might try to do a Crimea redux in the Donbas region. There is a significant minority of citizens of Ukraine who probably would be happy to have their territory annexed by Putin, who are Russian speaking and identify more with Putin and the Russian state than they do with the Ukrainian state. But then there's a very large number of Ukrainian citizens who hold the exact opposite view. Like Ukrainian nationalism is a very potent force too. And right, the reason why it seems much more improbable that Putin would sack Kiev is that, if it's the Crimea, which is majority Russian speaking, and if it's the Donbas region, which is majority Russian speaking, you can make a coherent argument that, in a sense, this is natural Russian territory. They speak the same language. They identify more with us than they do with Ukraine. But Kiev, then you're talking about really going to war against the people who have no desire to be controlled by you, who have made it very clear, especially in the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years, that they don't want to be controlled by you. So that's why it seems a lot more unlikely that he would do that. So responding.
I would just add two qualifications to that. Mm-hmm. The first one is just to say that percentage of people in Ukraine who are more sympathetic to the Russian government than to the Ukrainian government has been going down over time. And it seems as though it's been going down precisely because of what Russia has been doing in Ukraine so far. I mean, life, even for the Russian speakers who are sympathetic to the Russian government in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, has been pretty awful since Russia conspired with separatists there to detach those areas from the Ukrainian government's control. I mean, the economy has been shattered in those areas.
15,000 people have died.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's quite a bit of bloody fighting, at least in eastern Ukraine, and what information we have suggests that this has considerably lowered the popularity of the Russian government, even to the Ukrainians you would think would naturally be most sympathetic to it. So I think the percentage of people in Ukraine today who would be sympathetic to a Russian invasion is quite small now. That's the first qualification. The second one is just to say that, yeah, I think your characterization of it is right. All of these are reasons why taking the whole of the country as opposed to just certain areas of it would be potentially exorbitantly costly for Russia. But on the other hand, taking more of the country also potentially creates a more lasting solution to the problems for Russian interests that are why all of this is happening in the first place. If you want to make sure that Ukraine doesn't become a consolidated democracy, doesn't reorient its economy toward the European Union and away from Russia, if you want to make sure that the oligarchs in Ukraine who are tied into the Russian economy, don't get expropriated or lose their influential positions in Ukrainian society, if you want to make sure that Ukrainian democracy never serves as an example for those who want more authentic democracy in Russia, a way to make sure that doesn't happen for a long time is to completely invade and conquer Ukraine and overthrow its government. So like that's sort of in the plus column for Russia engaging in a full-blown conquest instead of some more limited incursion.
Right. High risk, high reward.
Yeah. And I don't, my feeling is that the costs outweigh those benefits, but I couldn't point to conclusive evidence in favor of that.
Couple more things. So first of all, I mean, Putin has shown that he will do something like annex territory, and he really hasn't suffered much for annexing Crimea. I mean, people use that term and it's sort of vague what that means because, as you said, it's still recognized by the quote unquote international community as Ukrainian sovereign territory, but de facto it is under Russian control. Russian security services maintain Crimea. My understanding is that the main legal tool used to legitimate the annexation was a referendum.
Yeah, that sort of no one outside of Russia believes was remotely fair or legitimate. But
there's already a playbook here. So if Putin invades, it's conceivable that he would bring the majority Russian-speaking territories, Donbas region, under Russian coercive control, carry out a referendum, and annex it in that sense. And it would continue to be seen as sovereign Ukrainian territory by the international community, but in Russia. And Putin is primarily doing this for domestic political reasons. It would be seen as a success in Russia, just as the annexation of Crimea is seen as a success in Russia. Okay, we've established that there is a credible threat of invasion. It's a threat that the US takes seriously, that Ukraine takes seriously, I assume, although maybe we can talk a bit more about that, NATO member states take seriously. We've talked a bit about what the options Putin could take if Russia does indeed invade. Okay, so maybe a natural next place to go is to talk a bit about what Putin wants to get out of this. So he's saying primarily to the United States, but you could say to NATO or the Western world more broadly, he's saying to them, I might invade Ukraine and you don't know what I'm going to do, but maybe I won't if you give me X. So what is X? Let's talk a bit about that.
So I should point out, he hasn't made any explicit threat to do anything to Ukraine. It's been, and in fact, he's claimed that the real threat is the opposite, that Ukraine would resort to aggressive use of force against Russia, or that NATO might resort to aggression against Russia. He hasn't actually explicitly threatened anything with respect to Ukraine, at least not in the current crisis.
Do you have a sense or a best guess as to what he's actually doing? Do you think that that is a ruse?
No, I think what's actually on the table here is a credible threat of some kind of military incursion into Ukraine that will be very bad for the interests of the Ukrainians and NATO and the United States. And he's using the implicit threat of that to try to get what he wants out of the people on the other side of the bargaining table. I think it's fair to say that his ideal outcome is that in a constraintless world, his ideal outcome is that NATO and the United States pull away from Ukraine, and ideally also other countries that border Russia in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, perhaps Poland, Romania. And as a function of that, then Russia would be able to exert more influence, more control over those countries, and would be able to integrate them into the Russian economy instead of the Western economy, would be able to see to it that Russia sympathetic elites control the economy and government in those countries, and that, as a result, makes it easier for Putin and his caste of elites to remain in power in Russia and enjoy prosperity. I think that's the sort of ideal outcome, ignoring all the constraints that mean Russia won't actually get most of that, but that's sort of what he wants out of this.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you're probably aware of the following bone of contention between Russia and NATO, namely that I'm sure Putin argues, and many people who are more sympathetic to Russia in this conflict argue, that after the Cold War ended, NATO gave Russia assurances that it would not expand, and it proceeded to expand to the countries you mentioned, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, et cetera. But I think that not everyone agrees with that characterization. Some people dispute it. They say that that did not happen, that NATO, the United States, gave no such assurances. But nevertheless, the perception that NATO did give those assurances is widespread in Russia and among people who are more sympathetic to Russia's side in this. And obviously, if you think that's true, then you would think that Putin's desire to have NATO removed from those countries is more justified, because NATO was only able to extend into those countries because it was willing to break a promise it made to Russia. Now, obviously, I don't know the data here, but I'm guessing majorities of the voting publics in all of these countries did want NATO there. And obviously that would be a counter argument. But what do you have to say about the legitimacy of NATO being on Russia's doorstep in these countries that border Russia, et cetera?
The nature of these NATO members, like US allied countries, being on the border with Russia today doesn't strike me as all that different from the fact that these countries were on the border of the Soviet Empire and the Warsaw Pact and have been so for the last, more than half a century. So I don't, what happened at the end of the Cold War is that the Soviet Empire shrank until it was just Russia, and the Western aligned, NATO allied world expanded and, came to incorporate the part of Europe that was no longer part of the Soviet Empire or aligned with it. And, essentially the border of NATO moved to meet the shrunken Soviet Empire where it ended. As to the legitimacy of that, I haven't followed the debate over whether the US or NATO gave promises of any kind to Russia about expanding NATO. But I have to say, I'm very skeptical of the idea that either that the US or NATO offered forever promises, as in, we promise you we will never expand NATO into these areas. And part of the reason they wouldn't make that kind of promise is they're not going to do it. But part of the reason is that there's no reason Russia should find that promise plausible. I mean, there's no third party to enforce agreements between the US or NATO and Russia about this. And both sides know that whatever they agree to today might disappear tomorrow if the situation changes and, that it changes in a way that advantages one side or another. So I sort of feel like it's neither here nor there to ask, what the basis of the expansion of NATO is relative to negotiations that the US and Russia had in like the early 1990s. That was a long time ago. And I think it shouldn't be ignored that, to my knowledge, every single country from the former Soviet-aligned world that has joined NATO did so through the actions of a genuinely democratically elected government that was doing something that was immensely popular with the publics in these countries, and that as popular as it was in the early 90s or in the 90s when this expansion happened, it's got to be at least equally popular today, for precisely the reason that if you're aligned with the United States, the directives are basically go along with US foreign policy when you don't have a strong reason not to, but otherwise, develop your democracy, develop your economy, make money off of trading with the West, and, enjoy the benefits. And that's not what it looks like if you're aligned with Russia. What it looks like if you're aligned with Russia is that the Russia preferred elites in your country will benefit and enjoy more prosperity and privilege, but everybody else is going to be paying for those privileges. So for me, I sort of feel like the question about, whether promises were broken or not presumes that Russia and the United States and NATO are sort of actors whose interests should be given equal weight. And I don't share that presumption. The project of the US and NATO is democracy and prosperity and peace. The project of Russia, as far as I can tell, is the entrenchment of power for a tiny elite at the cost of everyone else.
Among Russia sympathizers and among the ruling elite in Russia and segments of the Russian population, intelligentsia, et cetera, I think there is sincere belief in Russia as an alternative to the West. So I think that, there are many in Russia who regard the West as in a state of decline, morally decadent, godless, And democracy and making money and prosperity, those terms ring hollow and have limited resonance for certain kinds of people who care much more about Orthodox Christianity, things like nationalism, which, whatever you may say about it, is a potent idea that stirs passions among certain kinds of people. So I just wanted to add that in. I think that the way you just framed it, one might ask oneself, okay, well, why does anyone support what Russia is doing, either in Russia or outside of Russia? Like, there are a significant number of even Americans who are sympathetic to what Putin is doing. And they tend in particular to be Americans who agree with a lot of the critiques of contemporary Western society that Putin and like-minded people in Russia make. That is, decadence, morally corrupt, godless, soulless, et cetera. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's probably room for a debate about which vision for society is superior. I don't think we can assume without any further discussion that the Western model of democracy and capitalism is superior to some sort of more traditional religious come nationalist alternative in Russia. I don't think we can assume without debate that the Western model is superior. I just want to note that that is a lively debate, at least in some circles. Now, I return to a point you've already made, which is that unless you simply do not believe in something like national self-determination, the views of Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Poles and Hungarians and Ukrainians really matters. Like, they probably have views on which of these two models is better and which planet they want to be orbiting around.
I would go further than that and say, I haven't done it, but my guess would be if you survey people living in NATO, let's say anywhere in NATO, and you ask them, would you rather live where you live now or would you rather live in Russia? You'll get the vast majority preferring where they live now. And if you ask people in Russia, would you rather live in Russia or would you rather live in Western Europe or North America? You will get a pretty large segment saying they'd rather live in Western Europe or North America.
Just out of curiosity, what do you mean by pretty large segment? You mean like a large minority?
I don't know how large it is, but I'm confident it's a lot larger than the number of people on the other side who'd rather live in the Russian system.
This is completely anecdotal, but my parents went on a cruise down what river would it be? The Volga?
In Russia? Possibly, yeah.
And spent a few days or maybe a week in Russia, maybe early 2010s. They were quite struck by the degree of support for Putin that they observed. Again, anecdotal, but go on.
And none of this is to say that, that what Putin's doing is not popular with the Russian populace, but that's very different from saying they prefer the Russian system to the Western system, about which I have my doubts. But I also think, so suppose that what you care about is the moral value of suppose you subscribe to the moral value of nationalism and the moral value of some particular religious orthodoxy, or maybe just the concept of religious orthodoxy in general. What we're discussing when we talk about Russia exerting more influence over Ukraine or the Baltic states or Romania would invariably involve Russia undermining and attempting to crush the organic nationalism in all of those countries, which is a nationalism that's virulently opposed to Russia.
Except in certain regions of these countries. And these are the grounds on which Putin did justify the annexation of Crimea. They're the grounds on which he would justify the annexation of the Donbas region if it comes to that.
I should look back at the most recent polls, but I know that Putin's popularity, even among Russian speakers in anywhere in Ukraine, has gone way down. And it's not at all clear that even in Russian ethnic conclaves within Ukraine that he would actually be majority supported anymore.
I thought maybe you were going to make one other point because you had done nationalism and you were going to move to Orthodox religion.
I guess my feeling on religious orthodoxy is any system which would increase adherence to religious orthodoxy in Eastern Europe is one that's going to have to do so at the cost of democratic or otherwise classical liberal values, because people there don't subscribe to religious orthodoxy by and large, at least not Russian orthodoxy. And
well, hold on, but that region is overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian. I mean,
Yes,
Poland
but
isn't.
that's different
Poland
from
isn't.
saying they adhere to Russian orthodoxy. I mean, which again is
Well, I mean, I will push back a little bit here because the Slavic speaking Orthodox Christian and even the Slavic speaking just Christian world, Slavic languages are similar to each other. Orthodox Christianity is distinct from
sure.
obviously Protestantism and Catholicism. Now, again, Poland is Slavic speaking, but Catholic, but still, this is an ethnocultural region where the peoples in the different countries do have significant similarities with each other. What we were talking about was, I was basically trying to put up the strongest argument one can for what Putin and his supporters and sympathizers are doing. That's sort of what I'm trying to do. And I know that they would not agree with your characterization that the West is great and Russia sucks. What the West offers is awesome, and what Russia offers is basically, kleptocracy and oligarchy, a system that benefits very few.
I mean, I did say that, so that's a fair characterization. But I think a more objective way to state it is that the majority of the populations in question,
yes,
see this as a choice between those two things and are very clear on which one they prefer.
Right. Let's say it turns out that a majority would prefer belonging to Russia. What would the normative implications of that be in your view?
I think that's a matter to be negotiated among the citizens of Ukraine. I mean, there are lots of models out there, including in Europe, for giving regions that perceive themselves as having very different interests or cultures from other parts of a nation a greater degree of autonomy or perhaps even full-blown independence. But the evolving normative standard certainly in Europe and arguably in the international community is that that's totally acceptable so long as it is consented to by both sides. So Catalonia breaking off from Spain would be acceptable to Europe and the international community exactly so long as the majority of Catalonians preferred that and the majority of Spaniards preferred that. And it wasn't acceptable because the latter condition didn't hold.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in your view, obviously, it would not justify Putin's annexing the Donbas region.
A part of that normative standard is that it is totally unacceptable for some outside entity to use force to extract some enclave from sovereign territory of another country.
Right. And if the majority of the Donbas region wanted to be part of Ukraine, not Russia, then it would be even more unjustifiable.
Yes.
But it's still unjustifiable, even assuming the majority would like to belong to Russia, in your view. I wanted to inject one thing, which is the very obvious but crucially important reality that Ukraine is extremely important to Russia. Some have even called it existentially important to Russia, at least Ukraine not being a NATO member state. But Ukraine is a top priority for Russia, a very low priority for Western European countries, very low priority for the United States. Or maybe to say it's a very low priority is overstating the case. But I guess here's what I want to say. If Putin can credibly threaten that he will invade Ukraine, the United States cannot credibly threaten, I think, that it will send a significant fighting force into Ukraine, a significant U.S. fighting force into Ukraine.
Agreed. Because, and in fact, the U.S. has already committed itself not to do that. President Biden has said explicitly, repeatedly now, that no matter what happens, the United States will not send its own military forces into Ukraine.
Okay, so let's pause here for a second. It seems to me that even if Biden had said otherwise, it wouldn't have been credible because there's no way in hell U.S. voters are going to let U.S. soldiers come home in body bags to stand up for Ukraine, especially given the last 20 years of American foreign policy. Do you think Biden said that because he knew he couldn't credibly state otherwise? Because it seems like it would be a bargaining advantage to at least keep that option on the table if it could credibly be kept on the table.
Yeah, I think before Biden spoke, the Russians already correctly understood that the U.S. was not going to intervene with its own forces on Ukraine's side in a war with Russia.
Or any NATO member for that matter.
I think that's correct. Yeah. As a result, for President Biden to say this has no cost with respect to, the balance with Russia, but it has the benefit that it first conveys clearly to the Ukrainian government, we can help, but we're not going to directly bail you out militarily, and thus you have to prepare for this yourself. And it's also, I think, a good domestic political strategy for Biden to reassure the American public that I understand you don't want American troops to be used for this purpose. I am telling you, I have no intention of doing so.
And what we have threatened to do if Putin invades is you can count on it, right? So the way I heard David Sanger summarize it is it's going to be banking and financial sanctions a la Iran, significant technological sanctions that would disrupt important supply chains to Russia and even make it impossible for middle and higher than middle class Russian consumers to buy the most recent electronic devices. And then third, a lot of material support, not just to the Ukrainian army, but also to all of these insurgents, these anti-Russian insurgent groups. And so the US is saying, like, if you invade, we will do all of those things. And then an important question becomes, to what extent can Russia weather those sanctions and that military support from the United States? And I know that China might be playing an important role here in extending a lifeline to Russia, or at least I read a headline saying that. I didn't actually read the article. So maybe you could comment on some of that.
As far as telling Russia or threatening Russia with what the West would do to Russia if it used these military forces to invade Ukraine, the West actually hasn't been very specific at all, and that's on purpose. It simply said, if you do this, the reaction is going to be quite severe and costs for you are going to be very high. They've discussed an enormous variety of measures that might be taken, everything from, supplying things to Ukrainian resistance to Russia that would make a Russian campaign and a Russian occupation more costly, to taking various measures to, punish elites who are seen as supportive of Putin's government in Russia, putting pressure on the Russian economy generally so that not just the elites, but everybody in Russia suffers as a result of this invasion. All of the things you've suggested have been offered as possibilities, but the West hasn't committed itself to any of these things. It simply said, let us lay out for you what the range of, nasty instruments available to us is to do things that would be really bad for the Russian economy and therefore for Putin staying in power.
And how capable do you think China and other less important tactical allies or more than tactical allies would be in helping Russia weather those storms without too much domestic strife?
I mean, it depends on which items from that menu of coercive instruments the West actually ends up using. But my feeling is sort of like China can do some things to lessen their impact on Russia, but there's, several of the options on that menu are things that, regardless of what China does, is still going to have a terrible impact on the Russian economy. Cutting Russian banks out of the world financial transaction system, that, China has no substitute for that. Doing things like reducing European purchases of natural gas from Russia. China's not going to make up for all of the resulting excess supply. Doing things like cutting off exports of high technology items to Russia. China doesn't produce those high technology items, at least not certain of those items, so it can't replace them.
I can only be general here. I know that Sanger said that Russia has learned a lot of ways to sanction-proof its economy. Obviously, one can only go so far, but they've sort of been through a lot of this before. They know how to deal with it to the extent that it can be dealt with, I think.
I mean, those things help, but the important thing to bear in mind is that sanctions proofing is not free or necessarily cheap. Right. Finding alternative ways to move capital in and out of Russia, to get goods into Russia and goods out of Russia, all that can be done. And the more you prepare for it, the easier it is to do that, but it is still inferior to simply being allowed to move goods and capital the way everyone else does. Right. So it'll still impose a drag on the Russian economy.
Yeah. And of course, as before, it will be spun as Western aggression. And that will be believed by a significant chunk of the Russian population. But still, regardless of the sources of the pain, if a population is in a lot of pain, that is problematic for the incumbent, right?
I mean, at least if they believe that replacing the incumbent with somebody else might make that pain go away.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we have established what Putin's goals are. Do you think that he is pursuing them rationally and effectively? Given his goals and given the tools at his disposal, do you think that he is behaving with a high level of instrumental rationality?
I mean, I think yes. And I can tell a story that makes what he is doing seem rational and instrumental.
Let's hear it.
But you know, I should warn you that I'm just naturally, it's sort of my working assumption that this is in general the right way to think about, you know, what leaders do in foreign affairs. We should assume that they're instrumentally rational and try to figure out, you know, what is it they must think about the situation in front of them that renders what they're doing rational.
And I want to hear the story right now. Before I do, though, I just wanted to note that based on the little research I've done, most commentators seem to regard Putin as pretty cagey and cautious. He games out all of the scenarios. He doesn't act impetuously. So even on the spectrum of world leaders with a lot of personal control over their foreign policy, Putin ranks as more cautious than perhaps some others would. I don't know. I can't think of a good counterexample. Okay.
Well, you know, my impression is he's a very careful and, you know, of the more typical variety of fairly risk-averse, cautious, calculating world leaders, which I think is much more common than, you know, as opposed to somebody who's quite risk acceptant and willing to take drastic measures, even when they could have very bad consequences.
But Saddam Hussein qualifies.
Saddam Hussein, Adolf Hitler.
Right. Yes. Yes.
You know, these were people who were willing to take quite extreme gambles that, you know, that objectively looked like the chances are better than even that this works out with the end of your government, and they were willing to do it anyway.
Right. Okay. So proceed.
So I think Putin is doing this in a way that keeps as many options as possible open. I mean, it remains an option today. He's done nothing that makes it impossible to come to some kind of a deal, whether it be with the Ukrainian government, with NATO, with the United States, with all of them at once, whether that deal be an explicit, you know, formally negotiated agreement or instead some kind of backroom deal that's not publicized. Those are still on the table. He's got these military forces in the area that make possible a variety of incursions into Ukrainian territory. But I actually think the strategy he's pursuing at the moment doesn't entail actually using that military force, although it requires that the other side believe that he might. And you know, my guess is the thing that rationalizes what he's doing is he's attempting to induce a belief on the part of the other side that the risk of war is substantial, because he knows that by doing that, you know, anybody engaged in business with Ukraine is going to be looking for the exit, because there's no point in, you know, building a factory or investing in a factory in Ukraine if it might potentially change national ownership sometime in the next few months. You know, if you have a choice about buying what you need from a Ukrainian supplier or buying it from somewhere else, right now you prefer to get it from somewhere else because you're worried the orders might not be filled if Ukraine's involved in a war. So what we're seeing is the Ukrainian economy tanking, as, you know, investors don't come in, or investors who are already there look for the exit, as capital flees Ukraine. Like, people with money in Ukraine look for ways to store it outside of the country so that it's safe from Russian expropriation. You know, all of these things are, in the short term and especially in the medium term, going to be very bad for the Ukrainian economy. And in general, in most democratic countries, anything that's bad for the economy is also bad for popular support for the incumbent government. And you could easily imagine a circumstance where, if this pressure being imposed on the Ukrainian economy and therefore on the government lasts long enough and is nasty enough, then you could well see the prime minister of Ukraine being replaced with somebody who is more willing to compromise with Russia and to give Russia some of what it wants in exchange for ending that pressure. That's a strategy that doesn't require those forces to actually invade Ukraine or do any damage. They just have to be there. And people, in particular, people participating in the Ukrainian economy and potentially influential over the Ukrainian government, have to believe that those forces might really be used for warfare. There have been instances in the past where a economically powerful country uses economic sanctions as a way to destabilize the government of the country that's targeted by the sanctions, and to try to see to it that the leadership of that government is replaced with somebody else who's more willing to bend to the demands of the powerful state that's imposing the sanctions. So, like, the U.S. And most of the world imposed quite severe economic sanctions on Iraq when it was governed by Saddam Hussein. And the explicit hope, at least for the United States, of those sanctions, it was these sanctions are so severe that they will crater the Iraqi economy. Once that happens, everybody who lives in Iraq understands that, as long as Saddam is in charge, or somebody's in charge of Iraq who won't give the international community what it wants, the economy will continue to be destitute. And the only way to rejuvenate the economy, to get back to prosperity, is to be rid of Saddam Hussein. Mm-hmm. So that kind of economic sanctions imposes these immense incentives for whoever the domestic opposition is to the targeted government to rise up and replace it. And in fact, over the course of the 90s, when the US sanctioned Iraq in this way, there were many attempts to overthrow Saddam. There were popular uprisings. There were all sorts of attempts to replace his government with one that could get along with the United States and the international community and end the sanctions. And in fact, these kinds of sanctions have happened repeatedly historically. I mean, the US imposed similar sanctions on South Africa when it was under apartheid. Similar sanctions were imposed on Chile in the early 1970s when it elected a communist to power. And so, my thinking is that what's going on here is that Russia is attempting this strategy. Only the difference is that Russia is not economically powerful enough to just impose restrictions on commerce with Ukraine that would do serious damage to the Ukrainian economy. So instead, they're resorting to building up military forces near Ukraine and creating a very real risk of war that in itself is enough to cause the Ukrainian economy to suffer.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I had only thought of it as a credible threat of invasion geared toward securing various concessions from the US and NATO. I had not at all thought about the fact that a credible threat of invasion really hurts Ukraine's economy and therefore hurts the Western-oriented Ukrainian government. I mean, it's brilliant.
We have seen in the last short time here, since Russia's been pursuing the strategy, that the domestic popularity of the current leadership of Ukraine has declined, even though the Ukrainian population remains very firmly committed. A very large majority is firmly committed to alignment with the West. Nonetheless, the popularity of the current leader has gone down. And it's not at all out of the question that, if the economy continues to go downhill and people perceive that the reason why is that the current Ukrainian leader won't compromise with Russia on how quickly to align with the West, then you could see, a vote of no confidence in the Ukrainian parliament. You could see a snap election. You could see the current leadership's resignation and replacement by someone else. And in all likelihood, whoever they get replaced with is likely to be vocally pro-Western. But the difference will be that the new pro-Western leader, who might be just as vocally pro-Western as the old leader, is nonetheless more pragmatic about it and more willing to compromise with Russia in order to end the crisis, the risk of war, and the economic deterioration that results from it.
A fairly effective crude model of how democracy works is the incumbent wins when the population is prospering and the incumbent loses when the population is doing badly, especially relative to expectations. But maybe the fundamental problem with democracy in practice is that very often a country is not prospering or failing to prosper relative to expectations for reasons that have nothing to do with the incumbent, right?
Yeah, I think it's in any situation, it's very hard to tell how much the fact that the economy is doing well or the fact that the economy is doing poorly is the fault of the current political leadership, right?
Very often it's basically unrelated or mainly unrelated. I mean, in U.S. history, it's very often.
But it's really hard to tell a lot of the time. Like,
yeah,
you can certainly find, in the United States, for instance, you can certainly find commentators who think that.
You can find partisan hacks who will attribute any economic downturn to members of the other party. But I mean,
Sure.
Just take like the 2008 financial crisis. Like McCain really paid dearly for that, right? It's probably the single biggest reason why Obama won in 2008. There are other reasons, but the single biggest reason is that the incumbent party, the Republicans, was presiding over hundreds of thousands of job losses every month. Now, was the subprime meltdown any more the fault of Republicans and Democrats? I would argue not. And that's not exceptional. Perhaps, most economic crises don't have much.
Plenty of informed people would disagree with you. And it's precisely the fact that there's no consensus about it that leaves your average voter uncertain about whether what's going on is the fault of the current leadership or not. And if you're unsure about it, but you think it might be.
So you think the notion that Republicans or the Bush administration are responsible for the subprime meltdown is a respectable point of view? Because I took interest in what caused the meltdown when it was happening and in the years afterward, and obviously ignored the analyses of people with any sort of obvious political agenda or political conflict of interest. And I don't remember coming across many analyses that located the root causes or the most important causes within either party. They had to do with areas of bipartisan economic consensus going back years or decades. Anyway, like this is a bit of a tangent.
My impression about any serious economic downturn in essentially any country is that there are plausible arguments to be made that either the crisis could have been prevented or mitigated,
made less severe or something like that,
by the decisions of the incumbent leadership. In my mind, that's virtually always plausible in the sense that it is very difficult to conclusively rule that out. And for that reason, voters who are uncertain about it have good cause for switching their support from one side to the other.
The only thing about what you're saying that doesn't sit perfectly with me is that what I see happening a lot is the economy is doing badly. The political spin machine spins it so that it is the fault of the incumbent party. And there are just enough voters who find that plausible. But to me, it has more to do with the gullibility or wrongness of the voters, the inability to distinguish dispassionate, informed analysis from political hackery. It's more because of that elections often turn on economic results than because there are really plausible arguments to make that economic prosperity or suffering can be laid at the feet of the incumbent.
I disagree. And, I think my position, it's fundamentally an implication of the following assumption, which is that nobody understands with any confidence why economies either do well or poorly.
We can at least identify bad explanations, right? We can't necessarily have certainty about what the good or the correct explanations are, but we can usually rule out bad explanations. And often the explanations proffered for economic crises are bad. They don't make sense.
Sure.
So yes.
None of that takes away from the argument I'm making, which is that in general, if you pick some actual instance of an economic downturn, no person with any respect for the scientific body of knowledge on economics could claim that they are highly confident in this is what caused this. Mm-hmm. And in general, for any economic downturn, there are lots of factors one can point to for which plausible arguments can be made that this either caused it or contributed to the fact that it occurred, or maybe had nothing to do with why it occurred, but had something to do with why it was so bad. And it's not at all unreasonable to think that governments, which, in general have lots of levers to manipulate the economy to reduce its impact on particular populations or whatever, that if you suffer a severe economic downturn, there's a decent chance it is partly the fault of the incumbent government. Suppose that your state of confidence about your understanding of the economy and why it's turned down is that, okay, with a 95% chance, this happened for reasons that have nothing to do with the government. And there's just a 5% chance that, okay, maybe some government policy like contributed to this or exacerbated it, or, some choice was made that could have mitigated it, but instead didn't. If you're otherwise indifferent between the two sides in the election, that should be enough to tip you away from the incumbent and toward the challenger.
No, it's a good point. It's like, even if you think there's a possibility that the government is significantly responsible, even if it's a fairly distant possibility, but even if you think there's a possibility, that might rationalize voting against the incumbent. Or you could even say, I don't think I'm positive the incumbent is not responsible, but I want to send a message to the political class generally that when the economy does badly, they are to be punished, right?
Well, and to take this a little bit further, if this is the way the median voter works effectively, like if collectively this is an accurate description of how voters respond to the state of the economy when choosing whether to vote for the incumbent or not, and everybody understands that this tendency is there, then what we expect to see is that creates a very strong incentive for leaders to do their damnedest to see that downturns don't happen. If they do happen, they're mitigated. If they do happen, they're as short as possible. In equilibrium, when we see voters replacing an incumbent, it should generally be the case that the incumbent has minimal responsibility for the downturn, because in expectation, the incumbent would have done everything they could to avoid it. Mm-hmm. But the fact that voters react this way anyway is what gives them the incentive to try to manage the economy effectively in the first place.
They can. Right. Yeah, I was just going to add, or at least to postpone the crisis until right after the election.
Sure.
Right. or to juice the economy in the 6 months leading up to the election, and that is a problem, right? But no system is perfect. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, this is taking us pretty far afield. It would be interesting to delve more deeply into this question. For example, I think it's always better to have like a case study, an example that you're talking about. It would be interesting to talk about the 2008 crisis and whether any reasonable argument can be made that it would have been better if the Democrats had been in power. But let's not get into that now. So just going back to the issue, do you think there's anything of significance that we haven't covered? I mean, obviously one could elaborate sort of ad infinitum about many of these things, but I guess what I mean is, for someone seeking to understand what's going on without spending an inordinate amount of time doing so, do you think we've covered the most important issues?
I would just add two other comments.
Okay, great.
So one of them is, I think the evidence is consistent so far with the claim that Russia is creating a credible threat of invasion in order to put pressure on the Ukrainian economy, and in so doing to destabilize the current political leadership in Ukraine, in the hopes of seeing them replaced with someone who might still be pro-Western, but is more willing to negotiate and make concessions to Putin.
By the way, is there any non-circumstantial evidence that is what's happening?
As I read their comments, that's exactly what the Ukrainian government thinks is happening.
Okay.
They have repeatedly said, yes, obviously we see all these forces. We're worried about the possibility of an invasion, but we're always worried about that. What's new about the situation is that it's creating panic in Ukraine. That's bad for the economy. That's bad for stability in Ukraine. And so, we want to try to remain calm about the situation. We want to encourage Ukrainians to remain calm about the situation. We want to advertise to the outside world that life goes on in Ukraine, the economy keeps on ticking over. And in fact, the Ukrainian prime minister has said repeatedly now that he would prefer that the United States stop making statements that emphasize the risk of war, that emphasize the potential for terrible things to happen, because those only contribute to the deterioration of stability in Ukraine.
Fascinating.
So I think the Ukrainians, from their statements, they understand that there's a very serious threat over and above the threat of military invasion, of being destabilized and Russia getting its way because somebody more pliable comes to power in Ukraine. And I think...
And of course, Putin understands and foresaw all of this and knew that it would be kind of easy to get the West ginned up about Russian invasion.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not that the West has fallen into a ruse or something. If you deploy this much military power this close to NATO members and to Ukraine, prudence requires that the West react in a way of, mobilizing its own forces, of starting to make threats that inherently raises the risk of war and worsens the economic consequences of the crisis. But that's not a mistake on the West part. If you don't do anything in response to this, you're sending a signal to Putin that, well, if you went ahead and invaded, nothing bad would happen to you, and then it would be quite tempting to invade. So this isn't. I don't think anybody's been tricked into making a mistake here on either side. But I do think we've seen evidence in the last few days that the Ukrainians have made their concerns understood to the United States, because we've seen that the tone with which U.S. officials discuss the crisis around Ukraine has become less dramatic than it was before, in part because I think there's growing recognition that all of this is bad for the pro-Western leadership in Ukraine, and thus, we should try to keep the lid on this. So that's comment one.
Yeah.
The second comment that I think should be borne in mind is that it is the nature of this strategy of using pressure on a country's economy to induce a change in its leadership that it might not only not work, it might actually backfire. It could easily be the case, for instance, that the declining popularity of the current leadership results in a parliamentary vote, or perhaps a snap election, which might very well result in an increased victory for the current leadership and the pro-Western elites in Ukraine, which could end up making the problem even worse from Russia's point of view. So I think it should be borne in mind that if you think this is what Russia is doing, you shouldn't expect war to happen anytime in the next several months, because it can take quite a long time for this pressure on the economy to manifest, for it to be noticed by more Ukrainians, for it to have more of an impact on their level of support for the current government. Typically months, if not years.
Is the main reason why the current incumbent party in Ukraine might win an even larger majority if new elections are held, that the public might understand what's happening and anti-Russian sentiment might trump economic pain, that kind of thing?
Yeah, they might, there are all sorts of reasons. Like they might conclude that, yes, if we elected someone more conciliatory, that might end the current crisis, but it's just going to happen again in a short period of time. What's really at stake here is whether Ukraine becomes more like the westerly parts of Europe, or is like kind of held in its current, transitionary state. And it might very well be the case that Ukrainians conclude, like, look, this future of incorporation into something like the EU and something like NATO offers such high benefits that it is worth tolerating even this cost today if it gets us closer to there. And if we instead, elected somebody who was going to end up doing what Russia wants, we might find ourselves in exactly this position again 2 or 3 years down the road. So it doesn't really solve anything.
It might be a really interesting test of the economy determines electoral outcomes model. I mean, obviously not a definitive test, but an interesting test case.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the case that the economy there are occasions where a recession, somebody gets reelected, and there are cases where the economy is doing well and somebody, an incumbent loses office.
Not that many, though.
But there are instances.
Yeah. It's hard to think of any in recent American history. Maybe I'm blanking on some examples.
But it's also true that, how much of an impact this risk of war is going to have on the Ukrainian economy is still somewhat uncertain. And it might well be that it ends up not rising to the point where Ukrainians feel like they can't tolerate the situation and just stick it out. So there's a distinct possibility that even though this might be a rational gamble on Putin's part, that this gamble might end up failing, and either the current government doesn't end up destabilized, or it is destabilized, but it ends up entrenched in power. If that happens, all of those other options for using those military forces deployed near Ukraine are still going to exist, and the incentives for Putin to resort to one of those options so that he can come away saying this wasn't a total loss, I still, got something for Russia out of this crisis, are going to be pretty high. So even if I'm right about the strategy Russia is pursuing, it does not mean that there's no risk of a war occurring, and thus that the West and Ukraine should still be preparing for this.
Okay, final question. The year is 2037. Is Ukraine a member of the EU and NATO? What probability do you assign to the answer being yes, and how much confidence do you have in that answer? You can also just say, I refuse to do that.
That's a great question. I think, let's see, 2037. So what is that? That's 15 years away.
Yep.
I guess I would say better chances than not.
Mm-hmm.
That by that point, Ukraine, it might not be a member of the EU or of NATO by then, but I think there's a better than even chance that it is in serious negotiations to join one or both, and that it already has, affiliations with those groupings that are, not quite membership, but is a lot more than what it has now. And I think the reason is that I don't think a pro-Russian government in Ukraine is a long-term sustainable thing.
What matters is public opinion.
And I think,
more than anything, right?
What is likely to end up happening is that there's going to be some moment, and I'm sure this is understood by Putin and his government, that some moment is going to arise in which temporarily, for reasons that have nothing to do with Ukraine, Russia's coercive leverage is weakened. A recession inside Russia, large-scale protests against Putin's government in Russia, something that temporarily makes it difficult for Russia to engage in this kind of coercion. And that's going to create a window of opportunity for the Ukrainian government to make agreements with the EU and or NATO that Russia is going to find it hard to resist. And once those agreements are made, the ball game's over.